I was asked to talk about DNA databasing, and I could not imagine a more boring subject to try to address you about, so I thought I might talk about familial DNA search investigations, which include a search of your database to look for relatives in the database. Many of you know what familial DNA searching is, but in Denver we have been doing research to try to determine if we can use our database and use our state database to look for relatives of people that may be wrongfully convicted or maybe people that we're interested in catching for committing violent offenses. And so basically what we're doing is scouring our database to look for potential siblings or parents that may be in the database of people that left evidence in our cases that aren't in the database. And one thing I, unfortunately, as an elected official, get to talk to a lot of legislators, and sometimes that's a very unpleasant task, but I always try to remind them when we're talking about DNA and we're talking about funding for DNA and the kind of uses that we do, is that 90% of the victims of the crimes we solve with DNA, the victims are women, and they're women of violent offenses. The 10% that are left, the majority are kids. In my jurisdiction, when somebody gets convicted of one of these offenses, they face a life sentence. If it's a homicide, life without parole. If it's a sex assault, it's an indeterminate sentence to life. So when we're talking about these crimes, there's no question these are the most violent crimes, usually the type of predators that somebody in my position is interested in catching. But also if somebody's wrongfully convicted of this kind of offense, they're going to be spending an awful lot of time in the Colorado Department of Corrections. And I believe that we can use familial searching to solve cold cases, cases that are not cold, but any kind of cases, and also to exonerate innocent people. I was lucky enough to be able to go to the UK and see a lot of the forensics that they do there, and quite frankly, they are very efficient with their money, and they do an awful lot of real good work. I primarily was interested in their familial search packages that they put together. They have put together 157 specific packages on cases that they've been trying to solve. They limit those cases to cold cases, serial offenders. They have very strict guidelines how and when they use their database in this way, and they've had a number of successes when it comes to doing this kind of work. And I could go through the stories of each of these individuals, but I don't have the time, and they're all pretty much the same. These are murderers and rapists that have been captured through familial searching in the UK. 6 murders, 25 rapes, 2 child abandonments. The only woman, Miss Bond down there in the corner, she's the one that abandoned 2 of her children, gave birth to 2 different babies 2 years apart, abandoned them on a street corner, and they were able to do a familial search where they found her brother in the database and tie back to Miss Bond, who hopefully is no longer abandoning kids. One of their more famous familial searches actually came out of a trial that they had. It was a brutal murder in 1988 of Miss White. Miss White, 3 men were tried for killing her in 1990. They spent 4 years in prison, and they were eventually exonerated. Primarily, the Court of Appeals there found that the police had overreached in dealing with one particular of the 3 men, and they threw the conviction out. They were never retried. But I think that many of you that deal with exonerations understand. Now, this is the longest trial in the history of the UK up to that time, that when it gets the kind of media and gets the kind of attention that these 3 men got, that there's still a large majority of your society, your state, your city that believes the individuals that got exonerated are in fact the individuals that committed the offense. The Brits did not let this case go. They did a familial search on it. 15 years later, they were able to tie the real rapist, Mr. Gafour, through his 14-year-old nephew to the crime. And when they contacted him, they matched the DNA. He gave them a full confession. And there were apologies that were sent to the 3 men that were wrongfully convicted. This is a case that's currently pending in Milwaukee, and I've talked to Norm Gann about it, and I came across it. It's an individual by the name of Mr. Ott, who in 1995 got convicted of murdering a 16-year-old runaway. There was an eyewitness to Mr. Ott cutting her throat. He has since recanted. The other witness, who was the driver, drove them up to the place where the girl was killed. He himself was murdered a few years later. But there was DNA testing done in 2007. The Milwaukee DA's office agreed to let Mr. Ott out of prison. It's my understanding that they are looking into, over the next 6 months, if they have retesting or evidence that they may bring him back to trial and try him again. I suggested to Norm Gann that they should run a familial search on this case. It may very well exonerate Mr. Ott. It may very well give them a relative that they then can find somebody that's responsible for murdering 3 people in their community. I really think it is a perfect case for familial searching, both in exonerating somebody, potentially, and also in finding the serial murderer, at least for the 2 others, if Mr. Ott is responsible for this homicide. And then many of you are probably aware of the Darrell Hunt situation, and I have a clip from 60 Minutes on that.
Would agree, and not just for its potential to catch criminals, but for its power to set innocent people free. 23 years ago, Winston-Salem was shaken by a brutal killing. A young newspaper editor named Deborah Sykes was dragged to this grassy area, raped and stabbed 16 times. Although there was little to go on, Darrell Hunt was charged with first-degree murder. Did they have a fingerprint?
No.
Did they have any blood?
No.
Did they have any semen?
They had semen, but it didn't match me.
It didn't match his blood type, and yet Hunt was convicted and sentenced to life. 10 years later, when DNA testing came along, it showed he was not the rapist. But to Hunt's astonishment, the judge said he still could have committed the murder and sent him right back to prison. He spent another 9 years behind bars before the state ran the DNA from the crime scene through North Carolina's database. And that's when things got interesting. They got what seemed to be a hit to a convicted felon named Anthony Brown, but the sample was so old it was degraded, and the result inconclusive. So they flew the sample to Angelo Delamanna's state-of-the-art lab in Alabama, which produced a clear profile that revealed that Anthony Brown was not the rapist.
You see, the donor of the semen is a 1920, but he's a 1723.
Right,
so
that one alone.
that one by itself, he's out.
But the 2 profiles were remarkably close.
Of the 26 alleles that are in the crime scene sample, this individual shares 20.
What do you say to yourself?
Biological brother, full sip.
Delamanna told his counterparts in North Carolina that they might want to check and see if Anthony Brown had any brothers. FBI policy doesn't prohibit a state from pursuing a partial match within its own borders. What he heard back the next day was not what he expected.
He has 11 brothers.
His 11 brothers.
6 of those brothers were deceased. However, there was one brother who was in a neighboring county on a misdemeanor parole violation.
The investigators' next move was right out of CSI.
They offered him a cigarette. He took that cigarette and then finished the interview, and they took that cigarette back to the laboratory, ran that very quickly, and it matched at all 13, and then that generated the arrest warrant.
The man who actually raped and murdered Deborah Sykes was Anthony Brown's older brother, Willard. Confronted with the DNA evidence, he confessed, and Darrell Hunt, after 19 years, was finally set free.
When you consider both parties, we will dismiss this case with prejudice.
And I'm convinced that but for the, obviously you see that in the tape, and that's why I talk about how important the post-familial search investigation is. Because in a situation where Darrell Hunt is in prison, basically after the DNA exonerated him, but for a good investigation and follow-up that got to Mr. Brown, Daryl Hunt was released. So it takes more than the DNA to actually get to who the person is, and that's what we're finding in the research that we're doing. I saw one of Barry's many statistics during lunch, and he indicated that there is the number of people that after an exoneration now have been found through the database. And you know, that number, I think, is way too low. And I think if we were to utilize familial searching, we could raise that number from 40 to 60%. And I've seen some papers that said we could increase hits by 40% if we were to use a good, sound familial search mechanism in the United States. So there was really no one outside of California that was doing any research around using familial searching in the United States. And maybe some of you are doing that, I just don't know. But we decided that we'd start doing it in our lab to see if we in fact could find a software that helped us do this, develop a software. We validated our software against Dr. Brenner's software. We paid him to come out, run his software in our database. Our database has about 1,700 known reference samples in it, and we ran it against our forensic unknowns of 900. And by using his software initially and then a software developed by somebody that works in my office, we were able to come up with 3 and then eventually 5 individuals in that small database where there was a 90% chance that we had the relative in the reference database. We used YSTRs then for those males. If there was a father, son, or brother connection, we used YSTRs to see if they had the same Y chromosome, and then we would continue our investigation if we got that kind of confirmation. I'm just going to show you one of the examples that we got. We were told there was a 90% chance that in an unsolved burglary where we had some earwax on an earpiece from a cell phone, we got a DNA profile. Our software told us there was a 90% chance that this was the offspring of this individual that's pictured here. He's somebody that's very well known to us in Denver. In fact, is serving a 96-year sentence for attempted murder. We ran the YSTRs to see if they have the same paternal line. We got the same YSTR type. Then we did the investigation that we do. We created a family tree. Of course, we weren't interested in the women. That left us 3 men that were the offspring of the father. We looked into our Department of Corrections records, and the first 2 had pretty good alibis. They were in prison at the time of our burglary. So that left us with the individual, the 3rd son. He was in prison at the time we were doing the investigation. We have an all-felon statute now in Colorado since 2007, and so we called the Department of Corrections and said, do you have this guy? And they said, yes. We said, have you DNA tested him yet and put it in the database? Because if they had, we should have had a CODIS hit. And they said, no. And we said, could you move him up on the list? And they said yes. And in 2 weeks, we had a CODIS hit from him to the earwax on our cell phone. We had a couple of other examples, and in all of the cases that we found, we were able to show that the individual our software was saying was likely related was the individual that we were looking for. So we decided, since we have a relatively small database, that we would engage our state crime lab and the CBI to see. They are the keepers of our state database, which has now well over 80,000 individuals in it, and they would run all the forensic unknowns in their database against all their forensic knowns. And they were willing to do that under a very strict protocol that they have written, and it is still being written and is still being edited, and I hope that we finish that soon. But we were able to then, out of that search, both with our database again and again with Dr. Brenner's database, to validate those 2 softwares, we were able to come up with 13 individuals where there's a 90% chance that they are somehow relatives. We wanted, though, to study, okay, 90% usually was pretty good standard, but how low could we go and still get that confirmation in the whys and still have a meaningful search if we did a post-search investigation? So we obtained 15 individuals, separate individuals, where we had a 75% chance where they were related. We asked our crime lab, the state crime lab, to send us, without the names, a sample of the DNA they had. We ran YSDRs and compared those YSDRs where it was a male-to-male match. We had 6 male-to-male matches, and we have confirmed with YSDRs that there's still a potential that these individuals are related. We don't have access to mitochondrial testing. We would do that with the females to males, but we have not been able to do that. Many of these are unsolved rape cases and serious crimes that we're hoping that not only will we show that this software can be used, but also will help us solve those cases. There were 9 pairs where we actually had a connection with a female, either in the database or it's a female crime scene sample. And our hope is that even though we don't have the mitochondrial to back it up, that we will be able to get those names and do the same type of follow-up investigation to see if we can solve those cases and set the parameters for a familial search policy that will hopefully be utilized in the state of Colorado.
But I think of 2 things. One is the victims. There'll be more victims if this person is not caught. And the other is the person that could be falsely accused and sitting in prison.
Just weeks ago, the city of Winston-Salem offered Hunt an apology and $1.65 million to compensate him for his years in prison. From his office overlooking the old county courthouse, he now works to help other former inmates re-enter society, and he's thankful that North Carolina isn't a state where a partial DNA match can't be pursued.
If it wasn't for this, then I wouldn't be here.
Thank you.